Good morning. On behalf of Mrs. Baird, our principal, I'd like to welcome each and every one of you to our Remembrance Assembly. We'd like to extend a special welcome to the other schools in the area who have joined us. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to the veterans and their families who are joining us this morning as well. COVID-19 has taken away so much this year. Now in November, we find most remembrance services around the world are canceled. But here's the thing. The veterans we remember each year never let an obstacle get in their way. So in that fighting Canadian spirit, we're taking Remembrance Day back. An online assembly is something new for us. And we couldn't have done it without the enthusiastic support of our technology mentor, Mr. Steve McEachern, and our music teacher, Mr. Pat Breen. Thank you to you both. We'll begin in a moment with the singing of O Canada. This will be followed by stories, music, and poems. We'll observe a moment of silence and conclude with God Save the Queen. The students performing in today's assembly have decided to keep their identities hidden. We do this to honor the 28,000 unknown Canadian soldiers who died during the 20th century. Lest we forget. Please stand for the singing of O Canada.
O Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love, in all of us command. Cal ton bras se porte l'épée, il se porte la croix. Ton histoire est une épopée des plus brillants exploits. God keep our land glorious and free. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee. O Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Canadians marked the first Remembrance Day on November 11, 1919. At the time, it was called Armistice Day. Before Armistice Day, countries rarely paused to remember their war dead. When they did, they remembered the great leaders who had brought victory. The First World War changed how we remember conflict. That war was a tragedy. Countries wanted to honor the 16 million victims. You might find it interesting to know that it was not a soldier or a politician who taught the world about remembrance. It was an artist. The Canadian sculptor Walter Aylward was already a respected artist in 1936 when he unveiled his famous Vimy Monument. Vimy Ridge was the site of a famous Canadian battle fought in 1917. Aylward placed 20 sculptures around his monument to teach future generations about war and remembrance. This is why the image of the Vimy Memorial is on the Canadian $20 bill. The Vimy Monument was a different memorial to the fallen. The base of the memorial was designed to look like a strong fortress. This represented the Canadian military strength. The twin columns represent the Canadian and French alliance during the war. Aylward wanted to honor the common soldiers who came from small Canadian towns like Sussex, so he spent 12 years chiseling the 12,285 names of the Canadian soldiers who died defending France. The story of remembrance begins at the base of the twin columns, where a statue is sacrificed on the altar of war and passes the torch of remembrance to a new generation. Their gaze looks up toward the top of the twin columns. At the top of the spires, the Canadian values of peace and justice remind visitors why Canadians fought in the war. Other statues express their generation's desire to break the weapons of war and live in peace, and remind us to care for the civilian victims of war. Other statues honored grieving parents whose children never returned. Finally, Mother Canada, the most famous Canadian statue, grieves for her lost children. She looks down upon the tomb of the unknown soldier. We need to remember, we need to hold on to all of those memories of those who are gone, lest we forget the role of honor and what they sacrificed in the end. So remember the scarlet flower, the little red poppy that never died on the battlefields, like the memories of all our countrymen. We wear them close to our hearts, like the little red poppy.
Welcome to Normandy, France. This is the Canadian Military Cemetery at Bretteville. Over 2,000 Canadian soldiers are buried here from the Second World War. Mostly young men in their teens and early 20s. They were all killed during night attacks on a place called Verrières Ridge during that half-forgotten summer of 1944. In a few short years, you'll travel the world outside of Sussex. When you do, you'll find places like this, historic places, important to Canadians. It's natural to feel a little confused when you walk around a cemetery like this one, a cemetery full of teenagers. We're all left wondering the same question. What are we supposed to remember on Remembrance Day? It's a tough question to answer. You've only been on the planet a short time. But by grade 12, you'll have learned that there were good wars, bad wars, forgotten wars, and mistaken wars. When you're 11, 12, 13 years old, wars seem to happen in faraway places. And Hollywood and fantasy video games tend to muddy our understanding even more. It's no wonder Remembrance Day can be such a confusing time of the year for young Canadians. Not that long ago, veterans who knew war firsthand were around to teach us about Remembrance Day. Many of those veterans are gone now, but they left us a message for you. And here's what they wanted you to remember. First, they wanted you to know that each veteran served their nation proudly. Because of this service and sacrifice, today our flag is respected the world over. So they wanted you to know that service to community and country mattered to them. Secondly, the veterans did not consider themselves heroes, which I always found odd because they were. Instead, they considered themselves lucky to have survived. The real heroes, in their minds, were their friends who didn't make it home. Veterans also wanted you to know that wars are cruel and must be avoided if possible. And it won't always be possible. Their young eyes had seen the rubble of destroyed towns, the killings, and the cold and hungry refugees. They didn't want you to see what war had shown them. And finally, veterans wanted you to know the power of forgiveness. In time, they made friends with old enemies. they realized that their former enemies had parents who experienced loss too. War, they realized, makes victims of us all. It's a tragic fact of life that generations of Canadians have fought in wars. But it's also uplifting to know that Canadians have given so much to promote peace and justice around the world. So this morning, we pause our busy lives to honor our veterans. We also honor our men and women serving today who proudly make it their job to live up to this Canadian legacy.
Major John McCrae was a Canadian doctor during the First World War. In April 1915, he was serving in the trenches near Ypres, Belgium, in an area called Flanders. There he took care of the wounded soldiers while the battle raged nearby. In a letter, he described the war to his mother.
The general impression in my mind is of a nightmare. We have been in the most bitter of fights. For 17 days and 17 nights, none of us have had our clothes off, nor our boots even, except occasionally. In all that time, I was awake. Gunfire and rifle fire never ceased for 60 seconds. And behind it all was the constant background of the sights of the dead, the wounded, the maimed, and a terrible anxiety lest the enemy break through the front line.
In his spare time, McCrae enjoyed writing poetry. When McCrae's closest friend was killed in the fighting, he was buried in a grave with a simple wooden cross. When McCrae visited the cemetery, he noticed that wild poppies were already beginning to bloom between the crosses. Unable to help his friend or any of the others who had died, John McCrae wrote a poem to give them a voice. Today, this cemetery near Ypres, Belgium, marks the location of John McCrae's field hospital. It was here that he wrote the poem, in Flanders Field. The soldiers buried here were lives that McCrae could not save, including 15-year-old Valentine Strudwick, who had lied about his age to enter the war. More than 100 years later, local school children still leave poppies and teddy bears at his gravesite. While McCrae would die of pneumonia while serving in the war, he lived to see his poem grow in popularity. Today, many countries around the world use the poppy as the flower of remembrance.
In Flanders Fields. In Flanders Fields, the poppies blow between the crosses, row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky, the larks still bravely sing and fly. Scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead, short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe, to you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, the poppies grow in Flanders Fields.
Au champ le coquelicot sont pamisés, de lot en lot au prix de croix, et dans l'espace, la alouette diminue, lasse, mêlant leur chant au sifflement de Obisal. Nous sommes morts, nous qui sommes vieilles encore, à nos parents, à nos amis, c'est nous qui restons ici, au champ. À vos jeunes déabusés, à vous de porter leur flamme et de garder au fond de l'âme le goût de vivre en liberté, accepte le défi, sinon le coquillot s'enferme au champ.
A time of remembering. They fought so long ago and so far from here to keep us safe from harm. They boarded ships to sail away from family's home and farm. They braved the mud and cold and wet for days and weeks at a time. They dreamed of warmth and safety as they lay there in the grime. In that very first great war, they fought nearly a tenth of the population went. About 60,000 never came home, the most capable any country sent. They fought. In the second war that was longer, but they still answered the call. They sailed the sea in half a dozen ships and gave the task their all. By the time that war had ended, the number of ships had grown, and they policed half the Atlantic, helping bring others safely home.
High flight. Flying Officer John Gillespie McGee was a 19-year-old fighter pilot with the Royal Canadian Air Force when he wrote the poem High Flight. He loved writing poetry in school and was inspired by poets who wrote about the First World War. He wrote the poem High Flight during the late summer of 1941. Flying in his Spitfire, he and 3 friends were patrolling the coast of France when they were attacked by German fighters.
McGee was the only pilot to escape the fight. Returning to his airfield in England, he sat down on his cot and wrote a poem inspired by his love of flying and the loss of his friends. He slipped a copy of his poem into a letter to his parents in September 1941. A few months later, John died in a mid-air collision over the skies of England during a training flight. Today, the poem High Flight is the official poem of the Canadian Air Force as well as air forces and astronauts around the world. High Flight by John McGee. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies of laughter, silvered wings. Sunwards I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 1,000 things you have not dreamed of, wheeled and soared and swung. High in the sun-slit silence, hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flown.
My eager craft through the footless halls of air, up the long delirious burning blue. I've topped the wind swept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while the silent lifting mine, I've trod the high and trespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God.
They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
When it rains, it pours, but you didn't even notice. It ain't raining anymore. It's hard to breathe when all you know is the struggle of staying above the rising water line. Well, the sky is finally opened, the rain and wind stop blowing, but you're stuck out in the same old storm again. You hold tight to your umbrella. Well, darling, I'm just trying to tell ya that there's always been a rainbow hanging over your head. If you could see what I see, you'd be blinded by the colors, yellow, red, orange, and green, and at least a million others. So tie up the boat, take off your coat, and take a look around. 'Cause the sky is finally opened, the rain and wind stop blowing, but you're stuck out in the same old storm again. You hold tight to your umbrella. Well, darling, I'm just trying to tell ya that there's always been a rainbow hanging over your head. Oh, tie up the boat, take off your coat, and take a look around. Everything is alright now, 'cause the sky is finally opened, the rain and wind stop blowing, but you're stuck out in the same old storm